My name is Nora Bennett. 4 months ago, a quiet little sound from the phone on my vanity changed my entire life. One soft ping, ping, just enough to shatter 15 years of marriage, trust, and everything I once believed was stable. My husband, Eric, was in the shower. I wasn't the kind of woman who snooped through her husband's phone, but that day, something told me not to let it go. A message popped up. Booths confirmed. 8 p.m. Friday. She'll love the red. No sender name. But I knew. It wasn't meant for me. Have you ever realized you were just a shadow in your own life? Share that feeling below. Hit like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment if you've ever been in a situation like mine, because right after this I'll tell you how I turned their romantic dinner into a nightmare they couldn't escape. I didn't make a scene. I put the phone back exactly where it was, turned off the light, and walked out like I hadn't seen a thing. But that night, I couldn't sleep. My heart pounded in my chest, not out of rage, but instinct. A strange sense that the message was only the tip of an iceberg drifting just beneath the surface of this marriage. The next morning, when Eric kissed my forehead like always, and walked out in the gray suit I had chosen for our 10th anniversary, I stood at the doorway and watched him. For the first time, I didn't see a partner. I saw a stranger, playing the role of my husband. So convincingly, I hadn't noticed all these years. I called in sick for 3 days, burnout from the start of the semester, I said. But really, I needed time to do something I'd never done in my life. Follow my husband. Eric hadn't set a password on his laptop in years. Maybe he assumed I'd never touch it, and for all those years he was right. But now, all bets were off. In his emails I found dinner reservations never mentioned, plane tickets to New York on weekdays he claimed to have executive board meetings, and bank statements showing strange wire transfers to a real estate brokerage I'd never heard of. I looked up the company name, and my heart sank. Eric had purchased a 2-bedroom apartment in Soho, registered under a shell company, paid for with our emergency fund, the same one I thought he was saving for our early retirement plan in Arizona. And it didn't stop there. In a deleted email still sitting in his trash folder, I found a series of photos, shots taken inside that apartment. Burgundy leather sofa, white orchid arrangements, warm yellow lighting casting a soft glow on the ceiling. And in one photo, Eric was holding a young woman in a red dress, smiling, her head tilted affectionately on his shoulder. And when I looked at him to dispute his claim, the eyes shone intense vividly on Mitch Floriano, her son, Diego, and Mitch. I noticed the name on her bottom. Brienne Eric Laurent. My whole chest opened up and dissolved, and for the first time I felt like releasing any pride. I had seen that face every day for 2 years, back when she was a senior and I was her scholarship advisor. Madeline Hayes. I remembered the day she came into my office, hands shaking as she submitted a petition for extended tuition aid. Her mother had lost her job, her stepfather was seriously ill, and she was juggling 3 part-time jobs. I was the one who proposed her scholarship extension to the faculty board. I even recommended Madeline for an internship at the university's media office, where she met a lot of people, including Eric, who occasionally guest lectured for the business law workshops. Back then she wore glasses, was painfully thin, kept her hair in a simple bun. But now, in that photo, she had a confident smile, radiant skin, and eyes looking at my husband with nothing hidden. Suddenly the house around me felt unfamiliar. The dining table where Eric and I had once planned our nephew's school applications. The sofa where I'd laid my head on his shoulder the night my mother passed away. Everything now felt tainted by lies. I pulled up internal university records and looked into Madeline's background. And then the final puzzle piece locked into place. The new university president, Lydia Stone, was Madeline's biological mother. No one at the university knew. Madeline had always used her stepfather's last name. But an internal email gave it away. My daughter Madeline Hayes is excited to continue working with the alumni speaker program. My daughter. I sat frozen. Not from anger this time, but from betrayal. I had mentored the daughter of my university president, paved her path, trusted her, and unknowingly handed my husband to the same girl who once called me her inspiration. I suddenly recalled a recent board meeting when President Lydia walked in and smiled warmly at me, saying, "Nora, it's wonderful that you're still as dedicated as ever. Students like Madeline clearly owe a lot to your guidance." Now I understood what she really meant. The more I looked back, the more I saw how everything had been orchestrated long ago, step by step. And I had believed all along that kindness would yield good things. Turns out, unguarded kindness is the easiest thing to counterfeit. I used to think I understood the law well enough to never be outmaneuvered. I teach advanced finance at the university. I've lectured on hedge funds, risk analysis, and even the tricks shady entrepreneurs use to evade taxes or hide assets. But I forgot one critical truth. When the person deceiving you is someone you've shared a bed with for 15 years, you won't see the red flags until it's too late. That morning, while prepping a lecture, my phone rang. The caller ID said, "Thomas Keene, our longtime family financial attorney, the one who helped us with paperwork for the joint venture fund 3 years ago. Nora, just calling to confirm if you finalized the second power of attorney form. Eric said you signed it at the school's fundraising gala, but we haven't received the official copy." I paused, trying to steady my voice. "What power of attorney form, Thomas?" He was silent for a moment, maybe surprised by my question. "The one granting Eric full authority to withdraw, transfer, and reinvest assets from the Bennett Growth Holdings Fund. On your behalf, it's Form 1052B. I collapsed into my chair. This couldn't be real. "I signed that at the gala?" I repeated, trying to sound casual. "Yes, Eric said you signed it while filling out the scholarship fund pledge. The two forms were clipped together." I remembered that night. A university charity gala. Eric usually hated events like that, but that night he insisted we go. I was chatting with the department chair when he walked up and said, "Can you sign this real quick, just the donation form?" I'm mid-conversation with Dean Stone. I signed, didn't read. For the first time in my life, the woman who always told her students to read the fine print had signed away control over more than $2 million, without even knowing it. I hung up, still holding the phone, but my palm was ice cold. This wasn't just emotional betrayal anymore. This was a calculated move to cut me out. Quietly, without a fight, using my own signature, I opened the investment fund files again. The name at the top still said Nora Bennett, but the control over the entire portfolio, withdrawals, and reallocations had been transferred to authorized financial proxy, Eric Bennett. And the worst part? He had already started withdrawing money. Small transfers sent to a newly formed shell company registered as Red South Capital, located in Soho. I didn't need much imagination to figure out what the money was funding. Decorating a 2-bedroom apartment with burgundy leather sofas, white orchids, and soft golden lights. I downloaded every bank statement, every contract, saved them all. My heartbeat was no longer from hurt, but the cold clarity of someone who realized she had been cast as the loser in a game that hadn't even begun. That evening, Eric came home late as usual. I still made dinner like any other day, creamy mushroom pasta, his favorite. He sat down, placing his phone face down on the table like a reflex. "Rough day?" I asked, pouring wine for both of us. "Exhausting," he sighed. "The Houston case turned out way more complicated than I expected." I smiled faintly. A part of me wanted to scream in his face, "Houston or Soho, courtroom or love nest?" But I said nothing. Kept my eyes on him. The safety I once felt in his presence had vanished. All that remained was a man skilled at deception, even in silence. "Oh, by the way," he said, as if suddenly remembering, "didn't the school send something about the scholarship fund? You signed it, right?" I smiled, hiding the tremble in my hands. "Yes, I signed everything." He seemed satisfied, raised his wine glass and gently clinked it against mine. That was when I realized that thank you wasn't for the dinner. It wasn't for love. It was because I, unwittingly, had helped him complete a legal fund transfer with a signature I never should have given. But what he didn't know was, I had already started gathering every piece of the puzzle. And once they were in place, I wouldn't ask, why did you do this? I'd ask, did you prepare for what happens when I know everything? I used to think that when a woman finds out her husband's been cheating and stealing from her, she'd smash the wine glass, scream, throw him out. But when it happened to me, my first reaction was silence. Not because I was weak, but because I understood something clearly. For someone like Eric, rage would only help him stage a new play, where I'd be the unstable wife and he'd be the wounded husband. I wouldn't let him write that script. That same night, after Eric fell asleep, I took out my personal laptop, the one I used for lecture notes and academic research, and sent an email to Marcia Levinson, the attorney who once helped me buy into my first equity deal when I launched a startup with a few fellow professors. We hadn't spoken in 4 years, but it only took 17 minutes for Marcia to reply. Nora, call me first thing tomorrow. If it's urgent, I can meet in person. We met at a small cafe in Cambridge. It was drizzling. I brought a thick folder, my heart pounding but my hands steady. I was no longer the wife left behind with a phone and a message. I was a woman preparing to fight, using their tools: law, evidence, silence. Marcia didn't ask many questions. She flipped through the documents, nodded, and said 3 words. He's an idiot. I couldn't help but laugh. I want to open a financial account under a new legal entity, no links to any joint assets. Good. I'll take care of it. And I need a professional investigator, not the kind who gets noticed. I know someone, his name is Malcolm, used to work with a team of federal defense attorneys, no recordings, no digital trail. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived like 2 separate people, a beloved professor teaching macroeconomics, eating lunch with colleagues, coming home to cook for a husband, secretly moving money behind my back, and a woman quietly pulling her personal investments from the joint venture account, rerouting them into a new legal entity named Alder & Finch Consulting, registered in Delaware, leaving no trace that led back to me. Malcolm moved like a ghost. He found everything: security camera footage of the Soho apartment entrance, receipts for furniture bought using a supplementary card Eric had issued to his marketing associate, even photos of Madeline and Eric holding hands as they left a boutique hotel in Tribeca on a Tuesday morning. One Eric had told me was a full-day trial session. But the thing that shocked me most didn't come from Malcolm. It came from me. While combing through past student records to trace Madeline's background, I returned to the university's internal archive. Her name appeared alongside a few sealed disciplinary codes, accessible only with special permission. I requested temporary access under my scholarship advisor credentials, a status I still held from my time on the academic board. The file opened. In 2012, Madeline Hayes, then only 17, had been temporarily suspended for involvement in a fraudulent scholarship application and GPA tampering ring led by her ex-boyfriend. But since she was a minor, the case had been sealed after she completed the school's honor restoration program. At the bottom of the file, I saw the signature for Academic Sponsorship and Supervision Agreement. And it was mine. I remembered everything. I had fought to keep Madeline at the university, convinced the board that everyone makes mistakes in their youth, that if we didn't give young women a second chance, we'd be failing the very generation we claim to uplift. And now, the person I once defended was helping my husband move funds out of accounts in my name into a private apartment of their own, planning a future behind my back, using the very trust I once gave her. I closed the file. There was no more pain. Only one feeling: clarity. I sent the file to Malcolm with a short message. I think I've found her weakness. He replied with a simple emoji. Okay. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew this for sure. From this moment forward, I was no longer on defense. I was moving toward them, step by step, with evidence, with precision. No noise, no warning, no chance to apologize. In all my years of teaching, I'd met every kind of person, but I had never met someone like Graham Hollis. Or if I had, I didn't recognize it then. I met him at a private meeting on asset disputes and evidence, organized by a group of trusted attorneys Marcia had introduced me to. It was a small gathering, about 8 people, mostly victims or stakeholders in complex financial disputes, that didn't yet have enough proof to go to court. I arrived early. I was reading through a file when a tall, composed man walked in, sleeves rolled up, carrying the kind of fatigue often seen in people who work in healthcare. He nodded politely but distantly. I didn't recognize him. Not until we sat down in a breakout group and he introduced himself. Graham Hollis, I'm a resident physician at St. Anne's, Boston. The name made me pause. I'd heard it before, I'd read it somewhere in Madeline's records. And then I remembered. 5 years ago I had seen a photo Madeline posted on social media. An intimate beachside wedding. The man in the picture was him. Back then I barely glanced at it. Now, he was sitting right in front of me. When the session broke for coffee, I approached him. Are you Madeline Hayes' husband? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Graham turned, a little surprised. You know Madeline? I used to be her scholarship advisor back when she was in college. A brief silence fell between us. Graham didn't speak right away, but I could see it in his eyes. A mix of unease and guardedness. He was trying to figure out why a stranger would bring up his wife, and why her name had surfaced in a meeting about manipulated assets. I didn't beat around the bush. I'm Nora Bennett, and my husband is having an affair with Madeline. Graham didn't react the way I expected. No shock, no denial. He sighed. A heavy sigh, the kind that seems to empty a man's entire chest. I know, he said, still staring into his coffee. I've known since last year. And I chose to stay. I said nothing, not out of judgment, but because I understood the feeling. That desperate need to hold on to something, because you're not ready to believe it's truly broken. I thought it was a phase, a mistake, he continued. She was struggling with work and she said Eric was the only one helping her through it. I gave a bitter smile. That's what she said to me about you. Graham looked at me. This time his eyes weren't skeptical, they held something else. Recognition. A kind of quiet solidarity that only comes from those who've lived the same betrayal. We didn't speak again until the end of the session. As we were leaving, I handed him a sheet of paper, a copy of the fund transfers from my joint account to the shell company Eric and Madeline were hiding behind. His hand trembled slightly as he took it. I had no idea about this. Neither did I, until 2 weeks ago. His eyes lingered on me, as if searching for something he couldn't name. Would you have time to grab a drink? I did. We sat at a bar across the street, a place where I used to meet former students for scholarship consultations. Madeline seems good at planning, I said, after ordering a glass of Chardonnay. Graham let out a dry laugh. She was valedictorian of her high school, labeled as high leadership potential, but no one ever said what direction that leadership would take. Graham wasn't flashy like Eric. He was quiet, grounded, a little reserved. But in the way he spoke about his pain, I sensed something Eric had never shown me. Honesty. He told me Madeline had filed for divorce, citing emotional detachment and prioritizing the hospital over the marriage. It was written coldly, precisely, and came with a lawyer. I used to think I was the one at fault, he said, eyes fixed on the table. Until today. I placed the full file beside my wine glass and slid it toward him. These are the full documents. Transfers, property records, photos. He didn't take them right away, just stared at them, like he wasn't sure whether he wanted to know. Then he nodded and slipped them into his bag. Thank you. Call me Nora. A slight pause, then a faint smile from him. Graham, I didn't know what that night would lead to. But I knew this. Sometimes, between two people who've been betrayed, all it takes is a simple nod to start rebuilding the trust someone else tried so hard to destroy. I chose Bellamy and Finch, a third-floor restaurant in a historic Back Bay building, where soft piano music always blended with the scent of oak wood and warm candlelight. Eric once called it a place for people who win big. He said that after landing a multi-million-dollar deal with Manhattan Capital, the same fund he was now using as a front to siphon assets out of our joint accounts. I booked a table next to the private room where Eric had discreetly made a reservation 3 weeks earlier, according to data Malcolm had pulled from the internal system. My table was separated by an ornate wooden partition, elegant enough to be polite but thin enough to hear every whisper on the other side. I wore a simple black V-neck dress, nothing flashy, the same pearl earrings Eric gave me for our 10th anniversary, now a stage prop. I arrived 15 minutes early, checked the setup, and sent a final signal to the 2 guests I'd invited. Graham and Mr. Douglas Vance, Eric's primary investor in the Terraface project. Douglas, in his early 60s, was a composed man who had once attended a seminar where I served as an advisor. Back then he had asked me for my opinion on Eric's business model, unsure whether to invest in a man with more ambition than capability. I had answered with all the loyalty I had then, "He won't let anyone down." Tonight I was going to correct that. Douglas entered through the back entrance as planned. Malcolm, with a discreet earpiece, made sure timing and placement were perfect. Graham arrived a few minutes after I did, neatly dressed, calm. His eyes were steady. No doubt, no pain. Just the cold clarity of a man who had seen the truth at its root. From the other side of the partition, I heard Eric laughing. His voice had that husky tone he got after a few drinks. Then, Madeline's voice, soft and honeyed. "I told you, no one controls you but me." I set my wineglass down and looked at Graham. He nodded. Everything was ready. At exactly 8:12 p.m., the glass door behind me opened. Douglas walked in, composed like someone simply searching for his table. Then he stopped, right at mine. "Ms. Bennett," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need to talk." Across the divider, the clink of glasses stopped. I didn't have to look. I knew Eric had gone pale. "Of course, Mr. Vance," I replied, standing to shake his hand. "You're welcome to join us." Douglas sat. The server walked by, glanced subtly, then recognized this was a different kind of table. I nodded to the manager, and immediately 2 new menus were placed before us. From behind the partition, Eric's voice rose, lower now, laced with suspicion. "Madeline, do you feel like something's off?" No reply. Just a few seconds of silence. Then the sound of a chair sliding. Madeline stood, likely heading for the restroom. But before she could take a step, Graham rose and stepped forward, blocking the narrow path between tables. In his hand was a brown envelope. He didn't say a word. He simply placed it on Eric and Madeline's table, opened it, and let the documents spill out. Bank transfer records, apartment camera footage in Soho, and most damning of all, a printed message between Madeline and her best friend, where she wrote, "Once that idiot Graham signs the divorce for emotional disconnect, I'll drop the lawyer too. Half the assets plus the apartment is all I need to start fresh. Smart women don't choose love, they choose the board." Eric snatched the paper, read quickly, then seemed unable to stand. His hands trembled, lips pressed tight. Madeline. Eyes wide, face pale as paper, as if all the blood in her body had vanished in an instant. Douglas stood up and pulled his phone from his jacket pocket. "I believe our conversation is over, Eric. I don't invest in men who use their wife's money to fund their mistress." Eric jumped to his feet. "No, Mr. Vance, I didn't know about this. I didn't—" Douglas shook his head. "You knew. You just didn't think you'd get caught, and Nora, you don't owe me an explanation, just tell me. Where should I move my investments next?" I looked at him, unable to hide a bitter mix of gratitude and disappointment. "I'll introduce you to another team. They do real work and don't use marriage as a cover." Graham turned to Madeline. "I used to think you were immature, impulsive, but I never imagined you could calculate this far ahead." Madeline glanced at him, her hands shaking as if caught without a script. "Graham, it's not what you think. I just felt trapped." "No one's trapped while counting every dollar they pull from someone else's account," he replied. At that moment, Eric turned to me. "Nora, you did this. You staged all this just to humiliate me in front of everyone?" I calmly set my glass on the table. "No, I did this to end it. To end the years I spent beside someone I thought was my husband, when really, he was just a lawyer with a marriage license." The piano music kept playing, as if the restaurant was used to the sound of truth being served. And we sat there, a table for 4. 2 betrayers and 2 betrayed. But the power no longer belonged to them. Madeline was the first to leave the table that night. She said nothing, didn't look at anyone. She stood, grabbed a handbag far too small to hide any kind of excuse, and walked out of the restaurant. No goodbye for Eric, no final glance at Graham, a fading shadow slipping down the marble hallway. Like none of it had ever been real. But the consequences were very real. Less than 24 hours later, I received an email confirmation from Douglas Vance's office. Manhattan Capital had officially pulled all funding from the TerraPhase project, citing violations of ethical standards and conflicts of interest in financial governance. I knew what that meant. The entire financial structure Eric had spent the past 3 years building would begin to collapse, not because of an expose, not because of a courtroom verdict, but because of one well-timed withdrawal. 2 days later, Eric showed up at my doorstep. I wasn't surprised. He had called dozens of times, sent texts, even a 3-page email titled, "We need to talk like adults." I hadn't responded, but I knew he'd come. He wore a wrinkled shirt, no tie, his face damp with sweat though the weather was mild. I opened the door and stood in the frame. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice low. "Only if you answer one question truthfully," I replied. "Did you ever plan to tell me the truth? Even once?" A beat. Then he lowered his head. "No." I opened the door a few more inches. Just enough for him to step inside. But I didn't invite him to sit. "What are you facing right now?" I asked, plainly. Eric sighed, rolled up his sleeves, and walked past the living room, stopping by the window like he needed something to lean on. Douglas didn't just pull his investment, he notified other partners. 2 smaller funds have frozen their joint accounts with TerraPhase. They're demanding a full audit of every contract. Because you're the sole signatory on the entire transfer structure. Meanwhile, I, though exploited, am legally considered a passive grantor. You planned for that too? Not planned. It's written into the law. I just read it carefully. He stepped closer, like searching my eyes for something, but all I had left for him was a level of clarity he'd never learned to face. "Nora, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I just thought Madeline understood me. You were always right, always cold, always in control." I laughed softly. "And that's why you cheated on me?" "No," he said quickly. "No, I mean, Madeline made me feel needed. She made me feel like I had agency, like I had space. And I was what? The space? The wall in your way?" "Eric," I said slowly, "no one can lead you away if you haven't already stepped away from me first." I didn't say it with anger. I was stating a truth that had taken me years of living inside a lie to finally understand. He slumped onto the couch, fully collapsed, as if, for the first time, he'd lost the role he'd played for so long, the successful husband, the man who had it all. She left me. She won't text back. Won't pick up. I thought she'd stay." I met his eyes, and to my own surprise, the anger was gone. I felt pity. Not for our marriage, but for a man who destroyed everything he once stood for, chasing an illusion. "What are you planning to do?" he asked, eyes red. "Legally? I'll file for an uncontested divorce, with clear terms. I keep all my separate assets. Anything you already transferred, my lawyer will handle. I have nothing left, Nora." "Not my problem." He looked like he was about to say something else but stopped. I walked over to the table and handed him an envelope I'd prepared in advance. "These are the statements my attorney compiled, along with a summary of the asset division terms. I suggest you sign before this becomes something larger, otherwise, I'll let it go to court." "You'd really end it like this." "I'm not ending anything, you already did. I'm just putting the period at the end of the sentence." He said nothing more. He took the envelope, stood, and walked out, shoulders sagging as if he were carrying the wreckage of his own choices. I signed a divorce agreement with a black fountain pen Eric once gave me for our 8th anniversary, a gift engraved with my name and the words, "To my anchor forever." I kept the pen, but tucked it into a separate drawer, not out of sentimentality, but because I wanted to remember that even the most beautiful promises can be nothing more than polish over something already broken. The court ruling was clear. I retained full ownership of all premarital shares, including investments properly reinvested under legal title. Any jointly held assets, the house in Vermont, 2 retirement savings accounts, were divided per statutory guidelines, but Eric was ordered to repay the amount he had withdrawn from the shared fund without lawful consent. There were no drawn-out arguments, no public blame games. I declined every interview request from the media, even from a female journalist I deeply admired, someone who once wrote a piece about women in academia facing financial manipulation. "You should share your story, it could help a lot of people," she said. I understood, but I said no. I didn't respond to any more emails from reporters. I posted nothing cryptic on social media, I didn't name names. I still showed up to campus on time, still lectured in my steady voice, still had lunch with the old humanities faculty group. One Wednesday afternoon, while reorganizing the office bookshelf, I heard a knock. It was Graham. He wore a pale blue shirt, holding 2 cups of coffee, placing one on my desk like it was something he'd done every week for years. "The court sent the confirmation," he said. "The divorce is finalized." "No compensation?" I asked. He gave a half-sad, half-relieved smile. "None. Thanks to the ethics clause in the prenup my father insisted on. I thought it was unfair back then. Now, I'm glad it existed." I didn't ask how he felt. I knew. Just like me, he had lived through the quiet grief of losing someone he once trusted. Someone he once called family, and the version of himself he once was in their presence. We sat in the office as the early autumn light streamed through the window, casting soft lines across student files and the semester's lecture schedule. Life looked undisturbed, but beneath the calm were 2 people relearning how to trust. Not others, but themselves. "It feels like a fresh start," Graham said, his voice low. "But not the kind where you lose everything. More like you're more selective now. Like cleaning out an old library, only keeping the books you'd actually reread." In his eyes, there was no script, only a softness that language had never quite captured. We didn't rush to name what was between us. No labels, no boundaries. But in those quiet meetings, sometimes at a little cafe near his hospital, sometimes at the fall symposium where I invited him to speak, I felt it clearly. Between me and Graham, there was nothing left to prove. We had been deceived, but we didn't let the wound define us. A week later, I received an envelope from the university office. Inside was a handwritten note from the department chair. The one who had once sided with Eric during academic funding panels. The letter was brief. "Bennett, I once believed silence was a form of surrender. Now I understand it can also be the highest form of strength. Respectfully." I folded the letter and placed it in my desk drawer beside the old fountain pen. I didn't need praise. I just needed to know I hadn't lost the kindest part of myself. Despite betrayal, despite having once stood on the edge of collapse. In a noisy world, I chose silence as my weapon. And I had never felt more certain of who I was. I began every morning by watering the plants. It was a habit my mother kept until the day she passed. Not to make the plants grow, she used to say, but to remind yourself each day that you're tending to something beyond yourself. That fall, I rented a small apartment overlooking Charlesgate Park. It wasn't big, but it had sunlight and quiet. I brought a few old things with me. The armchair where I used to read every night, a worn wooden framed painting my mother had once hung in our living room, and a vintage Japanese teapot Graham had found in an antique shop in Maine, and gifted me for no particular reason. By then, Graham had begun teaching a course called Community and Health Recovery at the university where I worked. At first, it was a part-time role, filling in for a retired professor. Then the School of Public Health invited him to teach full-time. "Didn't think I'd ever return to a classroom," he said one late afternoon while we walked around Jamaica Pond. But standing in front of students reminded me of what I used to believe in. I didn't ask what that was, and I too was beginning to remember what I once believed. That knowledge isn't just for wealth, but for helping people escape traps disguised as civility. Vague contracts, relationships held together by sweet words. A few weeks after Graham accepted the teaching offer, I officially launched the June Bennett Foundation, a small but meaningful scholarship fund dedicated to female students who had experienced emotional manipulation or financial harm during their academic journey. No recommendation letters, no perfect GPA, Just a handwritten letter about their experience and a promise to keep learning, to stand strong, and to help someone else someday. The launch event was simple, held on campus, a sunny afternoon, no backdrop, no ribbons. I stood in front of a small group of colleagues, a few students, and the friends who had stayed with me through everything. Graham stood in the last row, wearing a gray shirt and soft brown sweater, his gaze calm, not dazzling, but steady enough to make me feel safe. I didn't mention my ex-husband. I didn't mention Madeline. I spoke only of my mother, a woman who never had the chance to go to college, but always believed her daughter should have a mind that knows how to analyze before it knows how to forgive. The event closed with a quiet invitation. If you're learning how to rise from where you fell, this space is for you. Every week after that, I received dozens of handwritten letters. Some were only a few shaky lines, some stretched 2 or 3 pages, the words clumsy, uneven, but all heartbreakingly sincere. One girl wrote that her ex-boyfriend took out a student loan in her name and disappeared. Another said her advisor had exploited her trust. Someone else wrote, "I don't need much money, I just need to know someone believes it wasn't my fault." I printed each letter, placed them in a wooden box, and locked it with a brass latch, not to hide them, but to protect them. Every Friday afternoon I walked past Graham's office. His classroom light always stayed on until nearly 6 p.m., students often lingering to ask questions. One evening I stopped by as he was stacking survey forms from his class. "They think I'm strict," he laughed, "but interesting." "Then we're alike," I said. "I'm strict too." We both laughed. The space between us didn't need much explanation. We had passed the stage of needing to explain who we were. Each weekend, we took turns cooking. Sometimes Graham brought over lime-leaf salmon from his mother's recipe. Sometimes I made the Italian soup my mother had taught me. He replaced the kitchen light, fixed the jammed balcony door. I helped him choose a new paint color for his living room, a soft gray instead of the worn beige Madeline once picked. He painted a slim olive green border around the window frames. I stood behind him, quietly watching him work. We had once been 2 people standing in ruins, thinking no one would ever wait long enough for us to recover. And sometimes, a person who walks with you through the park at dusk, silently carrying 2 cups of black coffee, is all it takes to know you've started over the right way. There had been many stages in my life, each one marking a different version of me. Finance seminars, graduate workshops, even private investor meetings where I was invited as Mrs. Bennet, the lawyer's wife. Back then, I thought my name was only ever mentioned as a polished footnote. But that afternoon in the university auditorium where I had taught for nearly 15 years, I wasn't standing there for anyone else. I had been invited as Nora June Bennett, keynote speaker at the annual graduation ceremony, founder of the June Bennett Foundation, and a faculty member students had voted, year after year, as most inspiring. The theme of that day's speech was, "True worth is never afraid of the light." I stepped onto the stage in a deep blue dress and an academic stole bearing the silver emblem of the finance department. Not to cover anything, but to step fully into the light. In front of me were hundreds of graduating students, their faces bright, eager, and anxious, just as mine once had been years ago. Behind me sat the university board, colleagues, and a few distinguished guests. I had prepared that speech for 2 weeks. But standing there, I didn't read from the page. I simply looked out, took a deep breath, and began speaking in the same voice I use when teaching. Slow, steady, and without embellishment. I used to think my worth came from how smart I was, how capable I could be, and how much I could endure in silence. I used to believe that if I was kind enough, things would somehow work themselves out. I paused, letting my gaze move across the young faces. But I learned some people will use that exact kindness to make you believe you don't have the right to question, the right to be angry, or the right to walk away. And I want to say this to all of you. Those about to step into the world with degrees, ambition, and wounds you haven't named yet. Let your worth take up space. Let the truth walk into every room with you. Hold on to yourself even when someone asks you to trade it for love, or power, or peace. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it lasted. long enough for me to know I had done the right thing. I bowed my head, then turned to leave. And at that moment, I saw Eric. He was sitting in the back row, in the section reserved for unlisted guests. No one had told me he'd be there. His face held no demands, no anger, just a nod, quiet, and too late. From someone who had stood beside me for years, yet never truly seen me. I didn't nod back. Instead, I turned toward the backstage area where Graham was leaning casually against the doorframe, camera hanging from his neck. "Did you get the shot?" I asked, half teasing. He smiled gently. "Not to save as a memory, just to capture a moment you might forget one day. But I won't." I walked over and stood next to him for a long while. Amid the noise outside, the students cheering and taking graduation photos, I felt peace. Not because Eric was gone, not because Graham was there, but because I had returned to myself. Whole, unedited, the way I was before love bent me into someone else. On the way home, we strolled through the garden behind the auditorium, the same spot where I once had lunch with my mother the day I was appointed associate dean. "Do you think everything happens for a reason?" I asked, watching the sky soften into shades of orange. "I do," Graham replied, "but not fate's reason. I think it's because people need to learn how to listen to the truth even when it shows up late." I looked at him, thinking of everything that had come before. The scholarship applications, the cold bank statements, the apartments built on lies. And then I thought of the sugarless coffee cups, the quiet afternoons by the window, and the way Graham placed his hand on my shoulder when no one else knew what I needed. "Have you ever been betrayed by the person you trusted most?" I whispered, not expecting an answer. "If you have, you'll understand. Sometimes the truth doesn't destroy your life. It just clears the path so you can start living it for real. You know, there are truths that feel like they'll shatter your entire world, but in the end, they're the only reason you finally feel alive." I don't feel anger when I think of Eric anymore, and with Madeline the bitterness has long faded. Because without them, I might have stayed in a marriage that only existed on paper, clinging to a title that had long since lost its meaning. I might have never found the courage to step back, look at myself, and ask, "Who am I?" when I'm no longer someone's wife. And what about you? Have you ever had to choose between the truth that hurt and the lie that felt safe? Have you ever kept quiet, afraid of losing something, only to realize that what you were holding onto had never really been yours? Share your thoughts in the comments. It doesn't have to be big. Sometimes one line is enough to let someone listening know they're not alone. And if you're drawn to honest stories about family, trust, betrayal, and the quiet, difficult work of rebuilding from the broken pieces, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There are more stories, rich and real, waiting for you. Because sometimes it's the most heartbreaking endings that lead us to the most beautiful version of our lives.